In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, lies are currency and identity is fluid. Isabella Morgan walks in designer heels and spins stories of old money with practiced ease. When she sets her sights on mysterious tech billionaire Alexander Pierce, she thinks she's found her biggest mark yet. But in this dangerous game of smoke and mirrors, nothing is as it seems, and the hunter might just become the hunted. Isabella Morgan adjusted her counterfeit Cartier watch as she stepped into Le Cirque, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The maitre d' gave her an appraising look, no doubt noting her Louboutin heels, purchased second-hand but meticulously maintained, and the vintage Chanel dress she'd spent 3 months' rent to acquire. These were the tools of her trade, the carefully curated costume of old money that she'd studied for years. "Ms. Morgan," she announced with practiced nonchalance, "I'm meeting Mr. Alexander Pierce." The name dropped like a stone in still water, creating the intended ripples of recognition. Alexander Pierce was the talk of New York's elite circles, a mysterious tech billionaire who'd recently arrived from Silicon Valley, making waves with rumored acquisitions and charitable donations in the 8-figure range. The maitre d' practically tripped over himself, leading her to a private alcove where a man in his mid-30s sat studying a tablet. He stood as she approached, and Isabella's carefully maintained composure nearly slipped. Alexander Pierce was devastatingly handsome, with steel-gray eyes and dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His Tom Ford suit fit him like armor. "Isabella," he said, taking her hand and brushing his lips across her knuckles, "you're even more beautiful than your profile suggested." She allowed herself a practiced blush, one perfected through countless society events where she'd played the role of Caroline Morgan Whitfield's daughter, heir to the fictional Whitfield shipping fortune. "You're far too kind, Alexander." As they settled into their seats, Isabella felt the familiar thrill of the game. This was her element, weaving truth with fiction until even she sometimes forgot where one ended and the other began. In reality, she was Isabella Reyes, daughter of a house cleaner and a mechanic from Queens. But tonight, she was Isabella Morgan, raised in Southampton, educated at La Rosey in Switzerland, and thoroughly bored with the tedium of managing her family's vast fortune. "I must admit," Alexander said, ordering a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild without glancing at the price, "I was intrigued when you mentioned your family's recent expansion into tech investment. The Whitfield name isn't one I typically associate with Silicon Valley." Isabella took a measured sip of water, buying time. "Daddy always said we needed to diversify. Old money stays old by knowing when to embrace the new." The line was practiced, one she'd borrowed from a Forbes article about the Vanderbilts. "Smart man, your father." Alexander's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but something in them remained calculating, watchful. "Though I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him at any of the usual tech conferences." "He's rather old school," Isabella deflected smoothly. "Prefers to let his team handle the technical aspects while he focuses on the bigger picture. You know how it is with that generation. They still prefer handwritten letters to emails." Alexander laughed, but Isabella caught something in his expression, a flicker of something that mirrored her own careful study of him. She'd learned to read people during her years of cons, and something about Alexander Pierce wasn't quite adding up. The wine arrived, and Alexander went through the tasting ritual with expertise that seemed almost too perfect, like he'd studied it rather than lived it. Isabella knew that move. She'd done the same thing, practicing with cheap wines in her studio apartment until she could discuss vintages and bouquets with convincing authority. As the evening progressed, they traded stories of privilege that felt increasingly like elaborate chess moves. He spoke of his early success in tech, of deals made in Palo Alto garages that turned into billion-dollar enterprises. She countered with tales of summers in the Hamptons and winters in Gstaad, each anecdote carefully constructed from magazines, and overheard conversations at charity galas she'd crashed. "It's refreshing," Alexander said as their main courses arrived, "to meet someone who understands this world, someone who knows the weight of legacy and expectation." Isabella felt a pang of guilt, quickly suppressed. "Yes, well, with privilege comes responsibility, doesn't it? Though I must admit, sometimes I envy self-made success stories like yours. There's something romantic about building everything from nothing." A shadow passed over Alexander's face, so quick she almost missed it. The story of the self-made man is rather overdone, don't you think? Sometimes I wonder if any of us are really self-made at all. The conversation shifted to their supposed charitable works, his tech education initiative for underprivileged youth, her family's arts endowment. With each passing course, Isabella found herself increasingly drawn to him, not for his supposed wealth or status, but for the hints of vulnerability that occasionally cracked through his polished facade. By dessert, they'd made plans for a second date, a gallery opening later that week where, Isabella claimed, her family's foundation was unveiling a new acquisition. In reality, she'd already begun laying the groundwork for that fiction, cultivating connections with the gallery's junior staff who could be convinced to play along. As Alexander helped her into her coat, his hand lingered on her shoulder. "You're not quite what I expected, Isabella Morgan." She turned to face him, their faces close. "Oh, and what did you expect?" "Someone less—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Intriguing." Later that night, in her modest one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, a far cry from the Park Avenue address she'd given him, Isabella kicked off her heels and began the process of transformation. The designer dress was carefully stored away, the borrowed jewelry returned to its hidden safe, the elegant makeup removed to reveal the faint dark circles beneath her eyes. As she scrolled through her phone, researching the gallery she'd need to infiltrate for their next date, a notification popped up. A news alert for Alexander Pierce. She'd set it up after their first exchange on the exclusive dating app where they'd met. But this article wasn't about tech acquisitions or charitable donations. It was buried in the lifestyle section of a minor Seattle newspaper, dated 3 years ago. Local tech worker wins small claims court battle. The photo stopped her cold. It showed a younger, scruffier version of her date, identified as Alex Petrovich, software developer, celebrating outside a courthouse after winning a $500 dispute with his landlord. The article mentioned he worked as a mid-level programmer at a small startup. Isabella sat back, her mind racing. Either Alexander Pierce had a remarkable doppelganger, or she wasn't the only one playing a role in this game of pretense. She should have felt angry, or at least disappointed. Instead, she felt a surge of excitement. For the first time in years, she'd met someone who might be as skilled at deception as she was. The question was, what was his real game? Opening her laptop, she began to dig deeper. If Alexander, or Alex, was running a con, she needed to know what it was. Not to expose him, but to understand him. After all, it wasn't every day you met someone who could match you, lie for lie. The next morning, she found 3 more articles about Alex Petrovich, each showing him in progressively more polished circumstances. In the most recent, dated 8 months ago, he appeared at a small tech conference in Portland, listed as a consulting architect. The transformation was remarkable, from schlubby programmer to sophisticated speaker, but it was nothing compared to the leap to the Alexander Pierce who'd kissed her hand at Le Cirque. As she prepared for work, her real job as an administrative assistant at a small investment firm where she gathered intelligence about the wealthy clients she would later emulate, Isabella considered her options. She could confront him, but that would mean exposing herself. She could ghost him, the safer choice. Or she could play along, see where this dance of mutual deception might lead. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Still thinking about last night, looking forward to the gallery opening. By the way, I've been meaning to ask, didn't the Whitfields sell their shipping interest to Maersk back in 19? Isabella smiled, a test, and not a subtle one. The Whitfields were entirely fictional, but he was fishing, trying to catch her in a contradiction. 2 could play at that game. "Common misconception," she typed back. "That was the British branch of the family. We're the American Whitfields. No relation, though the similarity of names has caused confusion in the past." His response came quickly. "Ah, of course, my mistake." Isabella imagined him in his own modest apartment somewhere, perhaps also researching her supposed background, finding the careful breadcrumbs she'd laid over the years. She'd created social media shadows, planted mentions in society blogs, even paid a freelancer to backdate some party photos. But would it hold up under the scrutiny of someone who clearly knew the art of deception as well as she did? As she headed to work, Isabella found herself humming. The gallery opening was 3 days away. Until then, she had a lot of preparation to do, and not just for maintaining her own cover story. She needed to understand exactly who Alexander Pierce really was and what he was after. Because one thing was certain, in this game of mutual deception, the stakes were higher than either of them had planned. And somewhere beneath the layers of lies, something real was beginning to take root. Something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Isabella called in every favor she'd accumulated over years of cons to ensure the gallery opening would appear legitimate. She convinced a junior curator she'd befriended to play along, promising him introductions to wealthy potential donors. She even arranged for a small write-up in a local arts blog, mentioning the Whitfield Foundation's involvement. Meanwhile, she continued her investigation into Alexander Pierce, or Alex Petrovich. The more she dug, the more impressed she became with his transformation. Like her, he'd built his false identity piece by piece, creating a paper trail that would withstand casual scrutiny. But unlike her, he seemed to be newer to the game. She found small inconsistencies, tiny cracks in his facade that only someone equally skilled in deception would notice. The morning of the gallery opening, Isabella received another text from Alexander. Looking forward to tonight. By the way, I've invited a few potential investors who are interested in your family's tech ventures. Hope you don't mind. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. This was an escalation, bringing other players into their game of pretense. Was he trying to expose her? Or was he simply maintaining his own cover? Of course not, Isabella texted back, maintaining her composure despite the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The more the merrier. It's always good to expand one's network. She spent the afternoon in emergency meetings with her gallery contacts, ensuring everyone was prepared for additional scrutiny. By 6 o'clock, she was slipping into a borrowed Versace gown, her mind racing through contingency plans. The gallery's main space had been transformed for the evening, with carefully curated pieces selected to suggest old money taste with new money ambition. Exactly what the fictional Whitfield Foundation would choose. When she arrived, Alexander was already there, looking devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was surrounded by a small group of men and women who carried themselves with the unmistakable air of actual wealth, not the careful imitation she and Alexander had perfected. "Isabella, darling," he called out, extending his hand. "Let me introduce you to some friends." As she approached, she cataloged the guests quickly. 2 venture capitalists she recognized from her firm's client list, a tech journalist she'd once served coffee to at a conference, and a woman who had to be at least a genuine socialite, given the way she wore her obviously real jewelry with casual disregard. "Everyone, this is Isabella Morgan Whitfield," Alexander announced, his hand settling at the small of her back. "The Foundation's newest director, and, if we're lucky, our host for many more events to come." Isabella felt the weight of their collective assessment. These weren't the usual marks she dealt with. These were people who moved in the actual circles she and Alexander pretended to inhabit. One wrong move, one slip in her carefully constructed persona, and everything could unravel. "Mr. Pierce speaks very highly of your family's recent tech investments," one of the venture capitalists said, studying her with keen interest, "particularly your blockchain initiative." Isabella didn't miss a beat. "We prefer to keep a low profile on that front," she said, smoothly deflecting. "Though I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current market trends. Alexander mentioned you have quite the eye for emerging technologies." As the conversation flowed, Isabella realized something was off about the dynamics in the group. The venture capitalists seemed to be studying Alexander as much as they were studying her. The tech journalist was taking mental notes, but wasn't pulling out her phone to record anything. Unusual for someone who should be interested in a story about a major tech billionaire. Then it hit her. These weren't Alexander's actual contacts. They were as much a part of his performance as everything else. But who were they really? And what was their role in whatever game he was playing? The evening progressed like a complex dance, with Isabella and Alexander moving through the crowd, each playing their parts to perfection. She noticed him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, probably evaluating her performance just as she was evaluating his. The layers of deception were becoming dizzying, lies wrapped in lies, each more elaborate than the last. During a quiet moment by the bar, the socialite, who had introduced herself as Margaret Van Houten, cornered Isabella. "You must tell me more about your time at La Rosie," she said, sipping champagne. "My niece is considering it for next year." Isabella launched into her well-rehearsed stories about the Swiss boarding school she'd never attended. But halfway through a charming anecdote about ski trips to Zermatt, she caught something in Margaret's expression, a flash of knowing amusement that seemed out of place. "It's fascinating," Margaret said when Isabella finished, "how much the school has changed since I was on the board of trustees there." Her smile was razor sharp. "Though I don't recall the winter carnival you mentioned. Perhaps it was after my time." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. The winter carnival story was something she'd fabricated, based on vague descriptions from travel blogs. But before panic could set in, she saw Margaret's eyes flick briefly toward Alexander, who was deep in conversation with the venture capitalists. That's when another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret wasn't really a socialite checking her credentials. She was part of whatever operation Alexander was running. But was she working with him, or was she playing her own angle? As the evening wore on, Isabella found herself in an increasingly complex web of interactions, each one laden with hidden meanings and potential traps. The venture capitalists kept steering conversations toward specific tech companies, as if fishing for information. The journalists seemed more interested in Alexander's reactions to certain topics than in any actual story. Near midnight, as the event was winding down, Alexander pulled her aside into a quiet corner of the gallery. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, his voice low and intimate. "The way you handled Margaret's questions about La Rosie, impressive." Isabella studied his face carefully. Was that admiration in his eyes, or was he setting her up for something? "Thank you," she said carefully. "Your friends are interesting, especially Margaret. She seems very knowledgeable about Swiss boarding schools." Alexander's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, she's quite well connected. In fact, she's been very helpful with some upcoming business ventures. Speaking of which," he paused, his hand finding hers, "I have a proposition for you, a business opportunity that could benefit both of us." And there it was, the first hint of his real agenda. But Isabella had a feeling that whatever he was about to propose wasn't the full story. Just as her true identity was still safely hidden, she suspected Alexander Pierce had more layers of deception to reveal. "I'm intrigued," she said, playing along. "What did you have in mind?" "Not here," he said, glancing around. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night, somewhere private. We can discuss it properly then." As she agreed to the dinner, Isabella's mind was already racing ahead. Whatever Alexander's game was, it was bigger than a simple con. The carefully selected guests, the probing questions, the elaborate setup. This was something more complex, more dangerous, and potentially more lucrative than anything she'd attempted before. Later that night, as she removed her borrowed jewelry and designer dress, Isabella pulled up her laptop and began a deeper dive into Alexander's background. If he was planning to propose some sort of scheme, she needed to know exactly what she was walking into. But as she searched, she found something that made her blood run cold. A small detail that changed everything she thought she knew about Alexander Pierce and his true identity. The detail was subtle, a small discrepancy in the dates of Alex Petrovich's employment history that led her down a rabbit hole of corporate registrations and tech startup archives. The Alex Petrovich she'd found earlier hadn't just transformed himself into Alexander Pierce. He'd borrowed the identity from someone else. Someone who had vanished from the Silicon Valley scene 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. The real Alexander Pierce had been a rising star in tech, but his company had collapsed amid rumors of fraud and missing investor funds. He'd disappeared just before the SEC investigation began, leaving behind a tangle of legal problems and angry investors. The timing of his disappearance coincided perfectly with the emergence of the Alexander Pierce she knew. Isabella sat back, running her fingers through her hair as she considered the implications. She wasn't just dealing with another con artist playing dress-up in wealthy circles. This was something far more sophisticated and potentially far more dangerous. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander, confirming their dinner plans for the following evening at a private dining club in Tribeca. She stared at the message, wondering if she should cut her losses and disappear. But curiosity, and something else she wasn't ready to acknowledge, made her type back a confirmation. The next day at work, she could barely focus on her administrative duties. Her mind kept returning to the complex web she'd stumbled into. During her lunch break, she did more digging into the guests from the gallery opening. Margaret Van Houten's identity seemed solid enough, but there was something odd about her connections to various boards and charitable organizations. They all traced back to companies that had done business with the real Alexander Pierce before his disappearance. The venture capitalists were harder to track, but after some creative searching, she found a pattern. They appeared at various events around the country, always in connection with high-stakes investment deals, but their firms seemed to exist only on paper. By the time evening arrived, Isabella had formed a theory about what she was dealing with. The question was, should she play along, or should she confront Alexander with what she knew? She chose her outfit carefully, an elegant but understated black dress that would let her blend into shadows if needed, with comfortable shoes she could run in, just in case. In her clutch, alongside her usual burner phone and carefully curated fake ID, she added a small recording device. The private dining club was housed in an unmarked building, accessible only through a hidden entrance in what appeared to be a wine shop. Alexander was waiting for her in a secluded booth, a bottle of rare Burgundy already breathing on the table. "You look stunning," he said, standing to greet her. His kiss on her cheek lingered a moment longer than necessary, and she caught a whiff of his cologne. Different from his usual scent, she noted. Everything about him seemed slightly shifted tonight, as if he too was adjusting his performance. "I took the liberty of ordering for us," he continued as they sat. "The chef here does an amazing tasting menu, and I know how much you appreciate fine cuisine." His eyes held hers. "Given your family's involvement in several prestigious restaurants?" "Another test." Isabella smiled, remembering the fictional restaurant holdings she'd mentioned in passing during their first date. "How thoughtful. Though I have to admit, sometimes I miss the simple pleasures of street food, don't you?" Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or appreciation for her subtle countermove. They were both acknowledging the artifice of their assumed positions while maintaining their facades. "About that business proposition," he said as the first course arrived. "I've been watching you, Isabella. The way you move in certain circles, the connections you've cultivated. You have a particular talent that I think could be very valuable." Isabella took a sip of wine, buying time. "How intriguing. Though I have to wonder, what exactly do you think my talents are?" His smile was dangerous now, all pretense of the charming tech billionaire falling away. "Let's be direct, shall we? You're very good at becoming whoever you need to be to get what you want. And I need someone with exactly that skill set for a rather delicate operation." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken understanding. Isabella set down her wineglass carefully. "And what makes you think I'm anything other than exactly who I claim to be?" Alexander leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because, my dear, I've been running the same kind of operations for years, and I recognize excellence when I see it." Just then, Isabella noticed movement at the edges of her vision. The maitre d' was locking the main door to the private dining room. In the shadows beyond their booth, she caught glimpses of other figures moving into position. She kept her expression neutral, even as her heart began to race. "You still haven't told me what kind of operation you have in mind." "Something ambitious," he said, reaching for his wineglass. "Something that will make all our previous cons look like amateur hour. But first—" He gestured subtly, and Margaret Van Houten emerged from the shadows, looking far less like a socialite now in her sharp business attire. "We need to discuss the real Alexander Pierce, and why you've been investigating his disappearance." Isabella's mind raced. The game had shifted dramatically, but she still had cards to play. The question was, which version of herself did she need to be to survive what was coming next? Isabella's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her wineglass as she assessed her options. The exits were blocked, but she'd counted 3 ceiling vents during her initial scan of the room, an old habit from years of running cons in upscale venues. The kitchen door was visible through a crack in the service entrance, and she could hear the faint clatter of dishes suggesting at least one escape route. But running wasn't her play. Not yet. "Investigating is a strong word," she said, maintaining her composure. "Let's call it professional curiosity. After all, when someone as accomplished as Alexander Pierce vanishes and then mysteriously reappears." She let her gaze drift meaningfully to the man across from her. "One tends to notice." Margaret moved closer, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "The question is, who are you working for? The SEC? The investors? Or is this personal?" Isabella laughed, the sound genuine enough to make both of them blink. "Oh, darling," she said, channeling every society matron she'd ever studied. "You're asking the wrong questions entirely." She reached into her clutch, aware of how the shadows at the edge of the room tensed, and pulled out a small USB drive. "You should be asking why I let you find those breadcrumbs about my investigation in the first place." Alexander's eyes narrowed, focused on the drive. "What is that?" "Insurance," Isabella said simply. "And leverage. You see, while you were having your people watch me, I was doing some watching of my own. The real Alexander Pierce didn't just disappear. He transferred a significant portion of his assets through a series of shell companies before he vanished. Companies that, interestingly enough, still show regular activity." Margaret's professional mask slipped for just a moment, showing genuine surprise. Alexander remained impassive, but Isabella caught the slight tightening of his jaw. "The question isn't who I'm working for," Isabella continued, rolling the USB drive between her fingers. "It's whether you want to risk finding out exactly how much I know about where those funds really went, and who helped them get there." The tension in the room shifted. Alexander leaned back, studying her with new interest. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Isabella took another sip of wine. "The thing about people who create elaborate false identities is that they tend to be running from something, or towards something. In your case," she glanced at Margaret, "both, I suspect. The real Alexander Pierce needed to disappear. You needed a new identity. And someone." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the shadows where others lurked. "Someone needed a convenient fall guy for when things inevitably go wrong with whatever you're planning next." Alexander's laugh was sudden and genuine. "You really are magnificent," he said, shaking his head. "But you've made one crucial mistake." Isabella tensed, ready for anything. "You assume we're enemies," he continued, "when in reality, I've been hoping you'd figure it out. The breadcrumbs, as you call them, weren't just there for you to find. They were an invitation." Margaret moved to sit beside Alexander, her demeanor completely transformed. "We've been watching you for months, Ms. Morgan. Or should I say, Ms. Reyes." Isabella didn't flinch at the use of her real name. "If you know that much, then you know I'm very good at what I do." "Precisely," Alexander said. "Which is why we want to offer you a real opportunity. Not just another con, but a chance to be part of something revolutionary." He gestured, and one of the figures emerged from the shadows carrying a sleek laptop. The screen displayed a complex network of financial transactions, corporate structures, and what appeared to be trading algorithms. "The real Alexander Pierce didn't just disappear," Alexander explained. "He evolved, and what he created before he vanished, well, let's just say it's worth far more than anyone realized. We're not just running a con, Isabella. We're rewriting the rules of the game entirely." Isabella studied the screen, her mind racing as she processed the implications. The patterns she saw weren't just money movements. They were the framework for something much bigger. Something that could either make them all incredibly wealthy or land them in federal prison for the rest of their lives. "And what makes you think I'd be interested in joining your little revolution?" she asked, though her pulse quickened at the possibilities. Alexander smiled, and for the first time, she saw something genuine in his expression. "Because you're like me. We're both tired of playing small games. This?" He gestured at their surroundings, at the trappings of wealth they both falsely claimed. "This is amateur hour. What I'm offering is a chance to pull off the biggest coup in financial history. No more pretending to be rich. We'll have the power to reshape the very definition of wealth." Isabella's mind was already racing ahead, seeing the potential angles, the risks, and the astronomical rewards. But there was something else, something in the way Alexander looked at her that suggested this wasn't just about the con anymore. "And what guarantee do I have that this isn't an elaborate trap?" she asked, though she was already fairly certain of the answer. Margaret spoke up, her voice carrying an edge of amusement. "The same guarantee we have that you won't take what you know to the authorities. Mutually assured destruction is a powerful bond, don't you think?" Isabella let a slow smile spread across her face. Mutually assured destruction only works if all parties have equal stakes in the game. So far, I'm not seeing the balance. She reached for the laptop, turning it slightly to get a better view of the complex diagrams displayed on the screen. Her years of working in an investment firm hadn't been wasted. She recognized elements of high-frequency trading algorithms, blockchain protocols, and something else, something that made her breath catch. "This isn't just about money laundering or market manipulation," she said slowly. "You're building a shadow financial system, one that operates parallel to the legitimate markets but invisible to regulators." Alexander's eyes lit up with appreciation. "See? This is exactly why we need you. You see the bigger picture." "What I see," Isabella countered, "is an awful lot of risk for people who seem to be doing quite well with their current operations. Why rock the boat?" Margaret produced a tablet from her briefcase and slid it across the table. "Because of this." The tablet displayed a news article dated 3 weeks in the future, already formatted and ready to go. The headline made Isabella's heart skip. "Global financial watchdogs announce coordinated crackdown on identity fraud in investment sector." "They're closing in," Alexander said quietly. "Not on us specifically, but on the methods we've all been using. The tricks that let us slip between identities, the gaps in verification systems, they're all about to disappear. In 6 months, what we do will be nearly impossible. Unless," Margaret added, "we're operating on a level they can't touch, above the system rather than within it." Isabella leaned back, her mind racing. The real Alexander Pierce. He didn't just disappear, did he? He found something. Something that scared him enough to vanish. Alexander's expression turned serious. He found a flaw in the global financial system, a way to, let's say, redistribute wealth on a scale never before possible. But he also realized that executing such a plan would require a team of people with very specialized skills. "People like us," Isabella said, understanding dawning. "Social engineers, identity artists, people who can move seamlessly between worlds." "Exactly." Alexander leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What we're planning isn't just another con. It's a revolution. One that will make us wealthy beyond imagination, yes. But more importantly, it will change the rules of the game forever." Isabella studied him carefully. "And what happens to those who don't want to play by your new rules?" "That's the beauty of it," Margaret interjected. "They won't even know the rules have changed, not until it's too late." A waiter appeared silently with their main course, and Isabella used the interruption to gather her thoughts. The proposition was audacious, possibly insane, but the potential payoff, and yet something still didn't add up. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You clearly have resources, connections. Why risk bringing in someone new at this stage?" Alexander set down his fork and looked at her intently. "Because you did something none of our other candidates managed to do. You saw through me. Not just the surface deception, but the layers beneath. You tracked down leads that our best people thought were buried. And most importantly," he paused, a hint of genuine admiration in his voice, "you did it all while maintaining your own cover perfectly." "Until now," she pointed out. "On the contrary," Margaret said with a slight smile. "Even now, we're not entirely sure we know everything about you. Are we, Ms. Reyes, or should I say, Ms. Chen?" Isabella kept her expression neutral, but internally she was impressed. They'd found her secondary identity, but not her tertiary. That alone suggested they were serious players. "What's the timeline?" she asked, implicitly acknowledging her interest. 3 phases, Alexander replied. "First, we establish our positions in key markets. That takes 6 weeks. Then, we trigger the first set of algorithmic trades, small enough to fly under the radar, but sufficient to create the patterns we need. That's another 4 weeks. Finally," he smiled, and for a moment, Isabella saw something almost predatory in his expression. "We let chaos do its work." Isabella took a sip of wine, considering. The plan was brilliant, ambitious, and incredibly dangerous. If it worked, they would reshape the global financial system. If it failed, they would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, assuming they lived that long. But there was something else, something in the way Alexander watched her, that suggested this wasn't just about the con anymore. There was a connection between them, built on their shared deceptions and mutual recognition. It was dangerous, possibly fatal, but undeniably real. "And what happens after?" she asked. "Assuming everything goes according to plan?" Alexander reached across the table and took her hand. His touch sent an electric current through her, and she wasn't entirely sure it was an act anymore. "That," he said softly. Depends on what we want to happen next. Together. The word hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and danger. Isabella looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, seeing both the mask and the man beneath it. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. The name that flashed on the screen made her blood run cold. It was from a contact she hadn't heard from in years, someone who should have been long dead. And the message contained just 3 words that changed everything. Don't trust him. Isabella's pulse quickened, but years of maintaining covers had taught her how to keep her expression neutral. She glanced at her phone with practiced casualness, as if it were nothing more than a minor interruption. Excuse me, she said smoothly, but I should take this. Family business never sleeps, you know how it is. She stood, noting how Alexander's people tensed slightly. Ladies' room? Margaret nodded toward a door near the back of the private dining room. Isabella could feel their eyes on her as she walked away, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The message burned in her mind. Don't trust him. From Jake Morrison, her former mentor who had supposedly died in a boating accident 3 years ago. Once inside the ornate bathroom, she quickly checked for surveillance devices, another old habit, before pulling out her phone. Her hands shook slightly as she typed, "Prove it's you." The response came almost immediately. The Pelican flies at midnight. It was their old verification code, something they'd established years ago and had never shared with anyone else. This was really Jake, somehow alive and reaching out after all this time. Another message followed. Pierce isn't who you think, neither is Margaret. Get out now. Isabella's mind raced. Jake had never been one for dramatic warnings. If he was telling her to run, there had to be a serious threat. But what did he know that she didn't? She pulled up the messaging app's location sharing. Disabled, of course. But the message metadata might reveal something. There. The messages were being bounced through servers in Singapore. Jake had always preferred Asian routing for his more sensitive communications. A soft knock at the bathroom door made her jump. Isabella, Margaret's voice called out. Is everything all right? Just freshening up, Isabella called back cheerfully. You know how this humidity affects one's makeup. She had maybe 2 minutes before her absence would become suspicious. Her options were limited. The bathroom window was too small for escape, and she couldn't risk running without knowing what she was running from. Another message from Jake. If you're still there, check the news about Horizon Tech from last week. Isabella quickly pulled up a news search. Horizon Tech. Where had she heard that name before? Then she saw it, buried in the business section of the Wall Street Journal. Horizon Tech, a seemingly minor player in the cryptocurrency space, had just been acquired by a holding company that Isabella recognized from the diagrams on Alexander's laptop. But it was the next article that made her blood run cold. 3 of Horizon's top executives had died in separate accidents in the past month, all after the acquisition, all ruled accidental deaths. One final message from Jake. The real Pierce is still alive, in hiding. These people killed to get his algorithm. They'll kill again. Isabella took a deep breath, checking her reflection in the mirror. Her face showed none of the turmoil she felt inside. She had played many roles in her life, but never with stakes this high. She typed back quickly, Need more info? How do I play this? Stay in character, Jake responded. I'm working on extraction, 24 hours max, just don't agree to anything. Another knock on the door, more insistent this time. Isabella? Alexander's voice now, smooth as ever, but with an edge she hadn't noticed before. Our dessert is getting cold. Coming, she called out, quickly deleting the messages and dropping her phone back into her clutch. As she opened the door, she found both Alexander and Margaret waiting, their casual poses not quite hiding their tension. Everything okay? Alexander asked, studying her face carefully. Isabella laughed, the sound perfectly calibrated to suggest mild embarrassment. Just my mother, she said, rolling her eyes. She's in one of her moods about the Foundation's next charity gala. You know how family can be. She watched them carefully as she spoke, noting how they exchanged quick glances. They didn't believe her, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Not yet. Shall we return to our discussion? She suggested, moving back toward the table. I believe you were about to explain more about the technical aspects of this venture. As they settled back into their seats, Isabella's mind was working furiously. She needed to keep them engaged while revealing nothing, buy time without making promises, and most importantly, figure out what they had done to the real Alexander Pierce and what they planned to do to her once they had what they wanted. The game had changed. This wasn't just about money or identity theft anymore. There were bodies involved, real ones. And Isabella had a sinking feeling that her own might join them if she didn't play this perfectly. Actually, Alexander said, his tone subtly different now. Before we continue, there's something else we need to discuss. He nodded to Margaret, who produced a thick file from her briefcase. We've been doing some additional research on your background, Isabella. Or should I say, Sarah? Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Sarah Chen, her tertiary identity, the one they hadn't known about earlier. How had they discovered it so quickly? The stakes were rising by the minute, and Isabella had a feeling the next few moves would determine not just the success of the con, but her very survival. Isabella's mind flashed to her Sarah Chen identity, meticulously crafted over 2 years, with a paper trail that would have withstood all but the most thorough investigation. For them to have uncovered it so quickly meant they had access to resources far beyond what she'd initially suspected. Sarah Chen, Margaret continued, spreading photographs across the table. Graduate of MIT, specializing in algorithmic trading systems. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? The photos showed Isabella in her Sarah Chen persona, complete with the glasses and conservative business attire she'd worn while infiltrating various tech companies. But something about the images seemed off. The angles were too perfect, as if they'd been taken by someone with professional surveillance training. Not a coincidence at all, Isabella replied smoothly, buying time to think. One should always have a background that suits one's ambitions, wouldn't you agree? Alexander's smile didn't reach his eyes. And what exactly are your ambitions, Isabella? Or Sarah? Or perhaps we should discuss your work with Jake Morrison. The mention of Jake's name sent a chill down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. They were phishing, she realized. They must have intercepted her communications in the bathroom, but they couldn't have decrypted them. Jake's systems were too good for that. They knew something was happening, but not what. Jake Morrison is dead, she said flatly, as I'm sure your research has shown. Is he? Alexander leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That's interesting, because our sources suggest otherwise. In fact, they suggest he's been quite active recently, particularly in certain Asian markets that interest us greatly. Isabella allowed herself a calculated laugh. And here, I thought we were past playing games with each other. If you're trying to trap me into revealing some connection to Morrison, you're wasting your time. I chose the Sarah Chen identity precisely because it would attract attention from people like you, people who understand the real game being played. She reached for the laptop they had shown her earlier, turning it to face her fully. These algorithms you're so proud of, they're primitive compared to what Morrison was working on before his death, which you'd know if you really had the sources you claim to have. It was a dangerous play, but she needed to shift their focus, make them doubt their own intelligence. The longer they spent questioning what she knew, the more time Jake would have to arrange whatever extraction he was planning. Margaret and Alexander exchanged glances. Prove it, Margaret said finally. Show us what makes Morrison's work superior. Isabella's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up the algorithmic trading diagrams they'd shown her. Look at your base functions here and here. She pointed to specific sections of code. You're still operating on standard market psychology principles. Morrison's breakthrough was understanding that markets aren't driven by psychology anymore. They're driven by the interactions between competing algorithms. She was bullshitting, of course, but with enough technical jargon to make it sound convincing. More importantly, she was watching their reactions in her peripheral vision. Alexander seemed genuinely interested, but Margaret's hand had moved almost imperceptibly toward her purse. Fascinating, Alexander said, and this time his interest seemed genuine. And you can access Morrison's original work? Access isn't the issue, Isabella replied carefully. Understanding it is. His systems were designed to evolve, to learn from their own trading patterns. By now, they've probably developed far beyond their original parameters. Unless, Margaret interjected, someone had a way to control that evolution, to guide it toward specific outcomes. And there it was, the real reason they were interested in her. They thought she had access to some kind of control system for Morrison's algorithms, which meant They didn't know as much as they were pretending to know. Isabella was about to respond when she noticed something reflected in the polished surface of a nearby wine bottle, movement in the shadows behind her, someone new entering the room. Her instinct screamed danger. Without missing a beat, she reached for her wine glass, deliberately letting it slip through her fingers. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth, creating a momentary distraction. As Alexander and Margaret reflexively moved back from the spreading liquid, Isabella caught a glimpse of the newcomer in the reflection, and her blood ran cold. It was a face she'd seen before in the Horizon Tech articles, one of the few executives who hadn't died in a mysterious accident, which meant, "I'm so sorry," she gushed, playing up the embarrassment. "Let me just—" She stood, reaching for her napkin while simultaneously assessing her options. The kitchen door was still her best escape route, but she needed something more than just a distraction now. Her hand brushed against her clutch, where she still had one card left to play, a card she'd hoped she wouldn't need to use. "Allow me," Alexander said, signaling for a waiter, but Isabella noticed how his other hand moved beneath the table, and she had no doubt he was signaling something else entirely. In that moment, Isabella made her decision. She reached into her clutch, fingers closing around a small device. Not the USB drive she'd shown earlier, but something far more valuable. "Before you do whatever you're planning," she said calmly, "you should know that everything that's happened tonight has been recorded and uploaded to secure servers, including your admission about Horizon Tech." The Horizon Tech executive stepped forward from the shadows, his face hard. But Isabella wasn't finished. "Jake Morrison isn't the only one who planned ahead," she continued. "The real Alexander Pierce reached out to me 6 months ago. He knew you were coming for his algorithm, knew you'd try to replicate his work. That's why he chose me, not just to watch you, but to make sure his failsafe was in place." She pulled out her phone, showing them a simple messaging app. One text, and every financial regulator in the world receives proof of what you did at Horizon Tech, along with the identities of everyone involved. Alexander's charm fell away completely, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Isabella smiled. "Check your trading algorithms, right now." Margaret quickly turned to the laptop, her fingers flying over the keys. Her face went pale. "The patterns, they're changing. The whole system is rewriting itself." "That's Morrison's real algorithm at work," Isabella said. "The one Pierce integrated into the global trading systems before he disappeared. The one that's been watching, learning, and waiting for exactly this moment." She stood, careful to keep everyone in view. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk out of here. You're going to let me, because if anything happens to me, that failsafe triggers automatically. Everything you've built, every identity you've stolen, every account you've hidden, it all gets exposed." "You'll never be safe," the Horizon exec growled. "We'll find you." "No," Isabella said softly. "You won't. Because Isabella Morgan doesn't exist anymore. Neither does Sarah Chen. By tomorrow morning, every identity I've ever used will be burned, every trail cold. That's what Morrison taught me. Always have an exit strategy." She reached the kitchen door, pausing for one last moment. "Oh, and Alexander? Or whatever your real name is. We could have been something real, you know. In another life, another story. But I guess we'll never know." With that, she slipped through the door and into the maze of back corridors she'd memorized earlier. By the time they realized she'd mapped out multiple escape routes during her bathroom visit, she was already gone. 3 days later, on a private beach in Bali, Isabella, now wearing a new face and carrying a new identity, opened her laptop to check the financial news. The headlines were exactly what she'd expected. Major irregularities discovered in several prominent tech companies, investigations launched, arrests made. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. "Well played, kid. Ready for your next lesson? Jay." She smiled, watching the sunset over the ocean. Sometimes the best cons were the ones where everyone thought they were the player, only to discover they were being played. And sometimes, just sometimes, the greatest deception of all was making people believe they'd seen through your lies, when they'd only scratched the surface. As for Alexander, she did mean what she'd said. In another life, their dance of deception might have become something true. But in this life, survival meant never looking back, never getting attached, and never, ever falling for your own con. She closed her laptop, ordered another drink, and began planning her next identity. After all, in her line of work, the only constant was change, and the only truth was that nothing was ever quite what it seemed.